Before we begin, I would like to give you a bio on the chief. And when I read his bio, I was really, really impressed, and I think you will be too, so forgive me. I'm going to read some of this to you. Dan Greathouse grew up in Waukegan and is a graduate of Waukegan East High School. He attended Western Illinois University, where he received his Bachelor of Science degree in Law Enforcement and Military Science. While in his junior year in college, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Army Reserves. After he graduated, Dan was assigned to active duty with the United States Army Adjutant General Corps at Fort Benjamin Harrison. Upon completion of his active duty, he came back to Waukegan, where he began his career with the Waukegan Police Department. Dan worked as a detective in the Criminal Investigations Division in the Narcotics Task Force from June 1988 to March 1995. In March of 1995, he was promoted to sergeant and served as the Community Services Division Commander, later transferring to Gang Narcotics Unit and then the Criminal Investigations Division. In May of 2001, he was promoted to lieutenant and was in charge of adult criminal investigations. In December of 2003, he was appointed to commander and served in the Office of Professional Standards and was also designated as the department's public information officer. In September of 2005, Dan was appointed deputy chief, and on August 1st, 2010, he was appointed chief of police for the Waukegan Police Department. Chief Greathouse is currently a member of the Lake County Chiefs of Police Association, the Chiefs of Larger Illinois Cities Association, the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Association of Chiefs of Police, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Planetary, yeah.
Chief Greathouse also serves on the Lake County Crime Stoppers Executive Board. The chief is married with 3 children, and in his off time, he enjoys camping with his family. When the chief has any additional free time, he spends it working on the manuscript of his first book titled Growing Up Gray. The book is a compilation of hilarious, heartbreaking, and thought-provoking observations of race relations in Waukegan during the 1970s and 80s as seen through the eyes of a biracial kid who was raised to have no concept of racial differences until his first day of kindergarten. So, pretty impressive bio, wouldn't you say? So, the chief and I met a couple weeks ago, as I do with all of the guests at the Wake Up Breakfast, to sort of do a run of show and make sure everybody has the same comfort level. And this morning, we've decided that we're going to divide this breakfast into various segments because the topics are so wide and so vast that we were afraid we were going to forget something. Now, I'm going to do my best to get him to talk as fast as he can and to cover as many topics as we can. However, I'm pretty sure we're not going to get to cover everything that I have written on these pages. So, at the end, if you have additional questions, please feel free to hang around. There are other officers in the room that will gladly answer your questions, and the chief will remain for a few minutes also. So, let's begin. Chief, I would first like to ask you about the current level of crime in Waukegan. In other words, compared to last year or previous years, how would you measure criminal activities in Waukegan? And relate this to the seasons of the year. Is it higher in the summer or higher in the winter? Tell us about that.
Okay. Again, thank you for being here. I appreciate the opportunity. Basically, from trending from last year, overall crime is down 12%. We've had a great year over the last couple of years of keeping gang violence and homicides down. We came off of a great summer where it's the second summer in a row that we've had where between the months of May and September, no one's been shot and killed in the city. And when looking in years past, that hasn't been done for several years. And then last year, we had the largest gap between homicides at all throughout the city since the 1970s. So we're really doing a great job of keeping the violent crimes down. Essentially, at this point, this time of the year, we're down probably 14% as far as burglaries. We're down 13% in thefts, and we're down about 4% in robberies. So as compared to last year, we're doing much better. In respect to trending crimes based on the season, One of the things we are always mindful is in November and December happens to be times of the year when traditionally we spike in crimes of, when it deals with retail theft, deals with robbery, and so that you understand the reasoning for that is because during November, December, people are preparing for Christmas or holidays and making purchases. People are outside shopping, and unfortunately, because of the cooler weather, they have the ability to wear heavy clothing, hoodies and stocking caps that won't stand out, where obviously in the summer, if somebody had a stocking cap on walking down the street, you would think something was kind of strange. So in the cooler months, they have the ability to wear the stocking caps and obviously pull down the cap and do that. And we've noticed the trend that people tend to get more desperate during this time of the year, during the holiday season, for several different reasons. But that's been a trend that's been going on for decades.
Okay. So while the economy is slowly coming back, and I think we've all seen some evidence of that, crime has not elevated, according to what you just said. So that being said, one of the big issues that we hear about, or that is talked about amongst the residents and the citizens, and the people that live and work in Waukegan, is the subject of manpower on the police department. So we read that in May of 2011, 8 officers were laid off.
That is correct.
Okay? And then it was reported that 8 officers were brought back.
That is correct.
So can you explain exactly what happened and the details of the layoffs, and then further talk about how you were able to bring these officers back on?
Okay. I'll kind of give you the Reader Digest version because it is a very, very long story. But essentially, as everyone understands, the economy was waning, and there was a problem with the budget, controlling the budget as far as tax revenues and different revenues coming in and trying to balance the budget. The mayor dictated that the city was going to have a balanced budget, so it was the idea of having to work within the budgets that was given to us. In May, well, let me take that back. In 2009, we applied for a COPS grant, community-oriented policing grant, which allows us to utilize more officers and have officers so that the government picks up a percentage of their salary. We were granted the grant for 2010. So we applied in 2009, we were granted the grant in 2010. And so the idea was to then hire 8 more officers to come to the department. Now it's either hire 8 officers or replace officers that were laid off. To make a very long story short, what happened was that there was a bit of a struggle with the unions, the budget, to try to determine if the unions wanted a raise. And there was a problem with that, with the police union allowing them to have a raise. And there were issues about layoffs, and if layoffs, they were looming from the year before. So the problem with that particular grant is that if the grant is accepted, then it's basically a no layoff clause for the next 4 years for the officers. And the grant is set up that it's a 3-year grant that the government pays for 3 years, but the 4th year is unfunded. So then the city has to pick up that 4th year and then retain those officers that were on the force that they hired, let's say the 8 officers, along with retaining your normal allocated strength. So it was an issue of just crunching the numbers and see if it was even feasible to be able to afford those officers for that period of time and then hold on to the officers even though they had like a 4% raise sitting on the table. So there were these battles of trying to get some concessions with the unions to try to work something out so that it was able to actually accept the grant. But at the end of the day, the problem came that there were no concessions made, and the city had to make the very difficult choice of not accepting the grant and then eventually laying off 8 officers.
So how did you make it work? Was there any residual effect to the citizens when we were running without those 8 officers?
Initially, there was any effect. A department our size traditionally absorbs a certain amount of loss anyway, between officers being injured, officers off, so we just made some adjustments. The problem came to play is as time went on, is that the officers, they switched to a new 12-hour shift that the year prior, where our department wasn't really used to handling. They're used to working on an 8-hour shift. So switching to a 12-hour shift, they have to deal with the dynamics and problems of that. They were able to work that out, but the problem came is that there was fatigue management issues. You know, in the middle of the summer on the 12-hour shift at our department, you're running and gunning. Now some other departments, smaller departments, can handle a 12-hour shift because the calls for service aren't there. but we have a very high volume of calls for service. So the issue came that we had a lot of officers working harder than they were working before, shorter staffed, so we had to come up with methods to address that. And unfortunately, what that meant was we had to take officers from some of our more tactical units, to put it that way. And we have the reactionary units, and then we have proactive units. The reactionary units are basically calls for service and 911s. We'll always have enough officers on the streets to answer the 911 calls for service. But you also need to have a pretty good contingent of proactive units to go out there, gangs, drugs, tactical crime units, things of that sort. And what happened was, unfortunately, because of the manpower strengths, we had to deplete those other proactive units and put them in the reactionary patrol units so that we would have the coverage. And as I said, the officers, they work hard, they sucked it up, and they stepped up, and they did their jobs. But as time went on, we were able to determine that because those proactive units weren't as active as they could have been and should have been, there was that residual problem then.
So the officers that you brought back, that ultimately came back, were those officers that were laid off? Were those original Waukegan officers, or were they officers from other places?
Of the 8 officers that were laid off, 6 of the officers we brought back. 2 of the other officers were offered the opportunity to come back, but they've gotten jobs, I believe, at Deerfield. Both of them started getting jobs. They got jobs at Deerfield. Interesting enough, probably tomorrow or the day after, one of the officers that did go to Deerfield that was laid off, we're bringing her back. She wants to come back to the department. So we're bringing her back in the next couple of days.
Well, that says something right there.
Okay.
Let's move on to another topic for a minute, and let's talk, you mentioned this briefly, let's talk about the issue of drugs in Waukegan. I know that Waukegan is not the only municipality that deals with drug issues, certainly not in Lake County, and certainly not in the state, and certainly not in the country. So what are we doing to curb the ever-rising tide of the sale of drugs, people bringing drugs into our community and then selling it on the streets? What are you guys doing about that? Because that is indeed a big issue. It
is, and what we've done is we've increased our drug and gang unit. As of last month, we have the largest contingency of a drug and gang unit than we've ever had in the city. So what we're doing is focusing the attention on narcotics purchases, the street sales. That's a big problem in the community, that people have the outlet to sell. If you understand that the drugs come from other countries, rarely other drugs produced here, but the drugs come from other countries, they get to a distribution point, and then they go into the local communities, and somebody has to peddle that poison. So the problem is that poison, more often than not, is peddled in more the urban environments on the street. It's a street level drug transactions. The goal is to try to prevent that street level drug transaction. That's been going on since the 80s, since I've been around. And part of the problem is the methods of preventing the sales. Part of the problem is also the correction system. A lot of the judges and the jail system and the prison system, they're full, and they don't view drug using and drug dealing as a violent crime. But there is always that effect, because a drug user has to commit crimes to supply his habit. So if you have an individual that has a $300 a day heroin addiction, first they go through their family, they go through their friends, and then they have to steal in some method to try to supply that habit. And that's where the residents take the hit, because that's where you'll see the burglaries, you'll see the robberies and things of that increase. So what we've done is we've refocused the attention of all the officers across the board to really put a big push on the curbing of the street sales and curbing of the trafficking into the community. And this time of year, when it's less of the street sales and they're selling out of the houses more often, then we're really amping it up to do search warrants and hitting the houses and trying to get people evicted. So when I met with you, we talked about what types of drugs are on the street, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit and tell these folks what you told me, what the trend, if you will, of drugs is right now, let's say, across the county. Well, the same drugs have pretty much been the drugs that have been around forever. You know, you've had your marijuana, it's almost legal now anyway, but then you have you have the cocaine, you have heroin that's been around forever, different pills, and then you have crack cocaine, which is a derivative of cocaine, but it's a cheap version of it, but a very, very potent and very dangerous version of cocaine. And that is, between that and heroin are the two biggest drugs on the streets right now. Years ago, when I was in narcotics, you didn't see as much heroin. It kind of went away. That was something more in the 60s and early 70s. But then as crack cocaine hit the streets, that was a drug of choice for the majority of the people that were users. And now you're seeing a trend back towards heroin, where people are using heroin because, quite frankly, if you have the ability to purchase and get the heroin, there are some individuals who can be functioning heroin addicts. So it's a very addictive drug, but you can work around. It's not like crack cocaine where you're just out of it and you're constantly what you call fiending for more and more and more. So heroin and crack cocaine are still the staple. What we're really trying to fight now is crystal meth. Out in the county and more in the rural areas, it started, and crystal meth has been around for a long time, but it's basically been pushed by biker gangs out west, southwest, south. It's a very filthy drug made from several different products, and we're not going to go into that, I don't have time. But the issue is that what's happening now is the Mexican drug cartels have built huge factories, laboratories, to basically manufacture large amounts of crystal meth. And what they're doing is it's not regulated in Mexico, it's not regulated in China and Japan where they're getting the chemicals to produce it, and they're shipping the chemicals to Mexico in huge, huge tankers, thousands and thousands of gallons, so that then they can cook up the product, and then once they cook the product at a lower price, then they're trying to flood the market into the United States. They're trying to establish a market in the Chicagoland area. Just like crack cocaine in the 80s, and late 80s and early 90s, our gangbangers in the Chicagoland area, who were the ones that are pushing the product, didn't understand crack cocaine, didn't understand how it worked, how to cut it, how to make it profitable. But as time went on, they learned, because they were doing it in LA and they were very successful. But as time went on, they understood how to utilize the product and how to sell the product, and then crack cocaine flooded our streets. What we're fighting now to prevent is the same thing with crystal meth. Is the idea is once the gangbangers in the Chicagoland area get a good idea as to how to cut it, distribute it, and then make a profit from it, trust me, they're going to do it. It's not a matter of, they're above that or whatever. They're going to do it, but they just don't do it now because they don't understand it. So the idea is these Mexican cartels are trying to figure out a way to establish a market in the Chicagoland area and obviously in other urban environments, particularly in Waukegan, so that they can flood the market, get all the people that are on crack cocaine hooked on crystal meth, crystal meth is about 3 times worse than crack cocaine, more addictive, and it's just a horrible drug. And try to get them hooked so they can change the market completely, and then they can control the market by have the flow of drugs. And it's much cheaper to make, cheaper to produce, and cheaper to send in than cocaine.
Would you say this is a problem in the schools in Waukegan?
Not yet, not yet. And as I said, that's one of the things why we really amped up our dedication towards fighting drugs is, like I said, in the 80s, I think we had an opportunity to slow the flow of cocaine or crack cocaine in the city. But by the time we realized crack cocaine was here, it was too late. So one of the things I've always said that we should have done is done more. So as chief, what I'm doing is dedicating as much manpower as we can to flood the streets with officers, to suppress crimes and suppress drug dealing. But the bigger thing is to recognize when it's trying to get into the market. We busted a few people here and there that tried to push the dope or push crystal meth. And I think the issue is if we can continue to keep that pressure on, it's less likely to get in our community as quickly. I'm realistic. It will eventually get here. As long as there is a demand, somebody will bring it. But the idea is if we really focus hard and trying to suppress it as much as we can slow the flow of it. It's not in the schools. It's not. It's sporadic here and there of use, and basically that's coming from out in the county, where somebody coming into more in Waukegan and they're partying with some of their friends. And say, hey, look at this, look what I got, and they try it, but they haven't got enough people hooked yet.
Wow. Okay, now let's move on to another really troubling issue, and one that is perhaps key to many of the other problems that we're experiencing in Waukegan and perhaps in other communities within the county, and that is the subject of affordable housing. So it's no secret that we have a high number of rental properties in Waukegan, and oftentimes those rental properties come with absentee landlords. And many times, the people that reside in those properties are drug dealers, convicted felons, and on and on and on. I would like you to really talk about the subject of affordable housing and what is being done to properly manage this epidemic, if you will, via code enforcement or through the PD or because it's apparent that it's everywhere.
Okay. Affordable housing, if you peel back our problems in our community, I think that's going to be probably one of the #1 issues that we have to deal with. On the surface, when you hear affordable housing, it sounds great. You know, people have an opportunity to live and living in a community that they can afford to live in. You get people from different areas being able to come in and stimulate, you know, the economy. Unfortunately, in reality, how it works is that what we are seeing anyway is because of the high rental property, the percentage, what we're seeing is developers coming through and buying several pieces of property, particularly, you know, with the economy as bad as it is in the housing market. You know, somebody with cash, maybe with money can pick up a lot of houses at a very low rate. So what they're doing is they're purchasing homes at a low rate and then putting anyone that could afford the first month's rent and the security deposit in the residence. They don't do background checks. They don't care. They're absentee landlords and they just want to get the bodies into the houses. And that is the problem that we're dealing with, because what ends up happening is, and I'll just make it really quick, when you think about why there aren't many drug dealers, gangbangers, burglars, or convicted felons living in Deerfield, it's because they can't afford to live in Deerfield. And that is very simply, it translates to is if you can figure, if they have locations where they can live, that's where they tend to live, where they can afford to live. And unfortunately in our community over the years, what has happened is all this affordable housing has allowed people that are, what I would call less desirable because of their criminal backgrounds, because of the, you know, gang members and drug dealers, they've been able to live in the neighborhoods. And statistically it's proven that most criminals that commit crimes commit within 3 miles of where they live. So the problem is that we've been dealing with is we have a high concentration of convicted felons living in our community. It's that simple. And unfortunately the recidivism rate is to a point that they recommit. Now, I would say that if perhaps the economy was better, if there were opportunities for people to get jobs, maybe they can get out from under that. But unfortunately, you know, like years ago when we would bust a kid or bust a gangbanger or something, we'd say, hey, you know, go out and get a job. Why are you doing this? Go get a job. And, you know, they'd say, okay, we'll try or not. Unfortunately, in this economy, it's difficult to get a job. It's difficult for college grads to get jobs. So to say that there's a convicted felon that's been to prison twice for burglary, and then now we pop him again, and we say, hey, you know, go get a job. You know, don't be a menace to your community. They legitimately say, well, I tried and I couldn't. So what they do is they revert back to what they already know. The problem is they're here, they're in our community, and you know, more often than not, because they can't get a job, they're going to do what they need to do to survive. That's one thing people I've learned over the years, they're going to survive. And the problem is they victimize other people in the community. So what we really need to do, and what we've been working on, is getting a handle of this affordable housing. You know, we already have in place ordinances with rental permits and things of that sort, where they have the landlords have to jump through a few hoops. Code enforcement does the best that they can of trying to enforce those things, but you know, they're kind of short on manpower as well. But what we're doing now is we're working with Corporation Council to implement some ordinances that make it a bit more strict for landlords to rent, to hold them accountable for the people that they actually bring into the community. For example, nuisance abatement. Nuisance abatement has been on the books with the state level for a long time, but it's just a very difficult process. Let's say if we hit a drug house and once or twice, and then we say, hey, we want this house, we sue the actual landlord and say that we're going to sue and hold the house for 30 days, a year, until these people evicted this problem. It's more or less punishing the landlord for allowing them to have this element in the community. Unfortunately, the state's attorney's office really don't take as many cases as they can. It's very difficult. It's a long process. So what we're doing is we're working with Corporation Council to try to come up with something we can do that locally, where we then can identify these problem residences, these problem landlords, and then craft the ordinances to hold them more accountable. And if they don't do what we need them to do with code enforcement and to do the proper background checks and to evict people that are problems, then what we end up doing is seizing the property or fining them. Once that gets put in place and we really are able to amp that up, I think it will make a dramatic difference. But it's just, it all boils down to having enough people to manage that, to be able to make it happen.
So with the high rate of foreclosures right now, there's a lot of board ups throughout the city.
Yes.
Is that an incentive for criminal activity? Do they look at these board ups and say, well, this is an easy mark, we can go in here and commit illegal acts? I mean, talk a little bit about the board ups, because I know I know that we do have a lot of affordable housing, but I also know that not every municipality, at least that I'm aware of, perhaps it's so, has the high number of boarded up properties that we have.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have a lot of foreclosures in Waukegan. We have a lot of boarded up properties, and if you can understand how the criminal element, their mind works, is they want to go into an area where there's not a lot of people. They want to go in an area where there's not neighbors and people that care about their community. And when you have several homes that are boarded up and or vacant, then they try to go into those areas and establish some sort of a drug market, be it drug, be it prostitution. Often they break into these homes and they use that as a base of operation because nobody's really watching. The banks don't do what they're supposed to be doing to really watch it as well. And you know they're overwhelmed by the sheer number of foreclosures they have as well. So it's a very difficult situation to deal with, and you know we can point fingers in all different directions, but obviously what needs to be done is we need to come up with some real solutions that work, opposed to just pointing fingers.
Wow. Okay, now, again, switching gears. I recently got a very thorough education on a relatively new program. It's the neighborhood policing program, which you started within the department for the benefit of the residents of the city of Waukegan. I want you to explain exactly what the program is because I don't think everybody knows about it, and also talk about how the residents can avail themselves of this program, when it should be used, when it shouldn't be used, and how they would use it.
Okay. The neighborhood policing program, it's a spin-off and a hybrid of neighborhood or community policing. We've all heard of community policing where you have an officer that's kind of pulled out of his traditional law enforcement duties of answering calls for service, driving around in a squad car. They're carved out to give more personalized service. What I've seen, and as I said, I've worked in community policing, I ran the division, so I understood how it worked. What I've seen, that the problem that we had in Waukegan is we had a lot of residents that wanted police services, but often felt that it wasn't that important to call the police. They figured the police had more important things to do than bother them with barking dogs, little small neighborhood problems. But loud music is another big problem. What we understand is that those quality of life issues are very important to a lot of people. So it was a matter of developing a unit that was able to address those issues in a more personalized one-on-one service, and that's basically what it is that we've taken officers, carved them out of their normal duties, and their sole purpose is to work within each ward. There's several, we have actually 8, but because some of the wards are smaller and don't require as much service, one officer takes 2. But each ward has their own officer assigned to their neighborhood policing officer. And what ends up happening is they work with the aldermen, they work with the neighborhood watch programs, they work with community leaders, but their job is to be available to any citizen that calls and wants to deal with smaller neighborhood problems. And then they can take the time to really address these issues. Usually when you call the police, loud music, or you have a neighbor that's being an idiot, you call the police show up, they'll yell and do whatever, maybe give them a ticket, and they'll move on. They got another call to go to. Neighborhood policing, the officer's job is to delve in deeper and find out what the problem is and try to resolve these issues. That could be long-term issues that have been a problem, with these neighbors forever. Their job is also to try to bring more cohesion to the neighborhood, to identify neighborhood problems by going door to door, talking to neighbors and finding out what the problems and addressing them. They're kind of like, how I look at it, is team captains in an area. So you have a neighborhood policing officer in a particular ward, and they know, let's say there's a drug problem over here. They know to reach out to the drug unit guys and say, hey, here's a problem we're having in our ward. Let's coordinate to address it. If there's a burglary problem, if there's a barking dog issue, if there's loose dogs, they know which city services to utilize to resolve those issues. And it's done on a more personal basis. We've given out the officer's cell phone, their actual email address. Before it was kind of, people would call a number and they'd leave a message, and at some point they might find the officer. I developed it specifically so they can easily reach out and touch the officer anytime they need to. And Sergeant Kelly is in charge of that unit, does an excellent job of coordinating that. And that's the different element to it, is it's personalized service. And they do a great job of balancing that. They were given the flexibility with their scheduling to address issues as they come about. So, usually we have officers that are locked into a certain schedule. They have the flexibility of changing their schedule to address the issues. If it's a stakeout of a particular address because of gang graffiti, if it's to help a little old lady because she's having problems with another neighbor that's just being uncooperative.
So this is definitely not to be confused with something that you perceive as serious. If you think there's something drastically wrong, dramatically wrong, you should still call 911.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if there's any
Not
problem,
your
you call
neighborhood.
911. Yeah, no matter what, if it's an immediate crime or immediate call for service, always call 911. But the idea is, what the problem we saw is a lot of people didn't want to call 911. They thought it was an emergency. They didn't want to deal with it. So it's a combination of dealing with smaller neighborhood problems and larger problems, more long-term issues, so it can be addressed.
So when you leave the room today, Ron will be standing by the back door and he will have handouts with the wards and with the associated officer and their appropriate phone number. So please be sure to pick one of those up as you leave.
You can get that on the city website as well. Okay. That's on there as well.
Okay, so finally, I want to talk about one last thing that we're not really proud of, but it's something that is inherent in most large cities today, and certainly Waukegan is not exempt from this, and that is the subject of gang activity. When I spoke with the chief a couple weeks ago, and he educated me on, I asked the question about gang activity, he started rattling off the names of gangs that he is aware of. The Latin Kings, the Gangster Disciples, the Vice Lords, the Four Corner Hustlers, the Satan Disciples, and the Maniac Latin Disciple. He went on and on and on and on. And I was floored by this. I was just stunned by what he told me. Talk about gang activity. Talk about what people on the street, residents, people shopping, doing business, going to school, in government, what should they do if they perceive that there's gang activity, and how would they even recognize gang activity if they saw it?
For the most part, when people see gang activity, they'll see it in the form of groups of young men hanging out, groups of young men walking down the streets. I'm not going to go into the detail of different colors and different ways that they signify or the way that they identify themselves, because as you stated, there are several different methods, several different gangs. For the most part, you won't see a lot of gang activity in more of a retail setting or industrial parks and things of that sort. What you'll see you'll see some of the neighborhoods and more of the areas where I say that we have problems with the affordable housing, with the vacant homes, with the drug sales. You'll see those in pockets of the city. Years ago, it was kind of put in one area of the city, and as time went on, it spread throughout different pockets. And pretty much in almost every ward of the city, there is some contingency of a gang located, and that comes in the form of what we've experienced now is single mothers from projects in Chicago. When they shut down the projects in Chicago, they had to find some place to live. So they come up here and they find a home, and unfortunately they have teenage kids that are probably already in the gangs, and then they start attracting the gangs and getting that process, and then that's when the drug dealing takes place. For the most part, gang activity in our community is all about drug sales, all about drugs. Years ago it was more machismo, and they wanted to spray paint, and they were tough guys, and they do what we call more gang banging. Fortunately, the youth of today, as you guys have obviously seen in the workplace, they're not as motivated, they're not as hard workers as they used to be. Well, the same problems you're having out in the private sector and with employees and their dedication is the same thing the gangs are having problems with. Their young people aren't dedicated to the way they used to be, which is great for us. Back in the day, they just for their gang, they would shoot at each other. They would work harder, they would do whatever they can to try to uplift their gangs. They're not committed to it to the way it is now. But part of the problem goes with that as well as the leadership. Before there was strong leadership in gangs, right, wrong, or indifferent, and they were able to control what they call the shorties. These are these younger kids out there. They're able to control them, saying, don't do this, don't do that. We don't want to bring attention to ourselves, we just want to sell drugs. Now these shorties are pretty much out of control. And they go out and they just do what they want to do, and that's where the gang violence come into play. That's where you're seeing a lot of the problems in Chicago. Now, we fortunately, have done an excellent job of suppressing that. And like I said, our gang violence has dropped dramatically. But you can see the effects of that in Chicago, where it's absolutely out of control, where it gets to a point that I don't care how many cops you have, when you have such a high concentration, you're going to have a really big problem. We are doing a great job at this point, but we must stay vigilant. We must always keep that pressure on them, because these are kids that are disenfranchised. These are kids that come from broken homes. These are kids that see no opportunity, no future for themselves, and they live in the moment. They live for today. They don't live for tomorrow. They don't even think about tomorrow. So, you know, a 14-year-old kid with a gun is the most dangerous thing walking on the streets today. And then we have to realize that. So the idea is to come up with methods to try to get these fringe kids and bring them in to help them with programs. And we have after-school programs. We try to reach out. But again, with everything, the problem is funding to try to get these programs to work and be more effective. So that part, as a community, we're losing that battle. We're losing it to these gangs.
So if you think you see gang activity in your neighborhood or near your place of business, and it doesn't appear to be active at that moment, that would be a case, correct me if I'm wrong, where you would contact your neighborhood police officer to come in and start investigating and looking into what is going on.
Exactly. I mean, and the idea is if they see anything suspicious. Now, what we don't want to get is, you know, we have Mrs. McGillicuddy seeing 3 guys walking down the street ready to go play basketball. That doesn't necessarily mean they're gang members. But call neighborhood police and talk to them, and they look into that and make that determination from there, because we want to make sure that the citizens have an opportunity to reach out to someone so they can ask questions and make observations. Often, let's face it, when something doesn't look right, doesn't feel right, it usually isn't. So give us a call, and then we can look into that. That's the idea of having neighborhood policing, so they can address those issues long and short term.
I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here this morning and for supporting the Chamber of Commerce in Waukegan. Literally, we are growing monthly. It seems like every time we turn around, we're getting more and more new members, and we are here to serve the business community. If you have any questions, please see Dan Sivia, the Vice Chairman of the Board. He can help you. Ron Osterline, who's flying around here somewhere, and be on the lookout for announcements of the calendar of events for 2013, where again we'll be bringing a wide variety of special events, including our 4 annual Wake Up with Waukegan breakfast. So thanks again, everybody, for coming. Drive safely and have a good day.